How's everybody today? Hope you're enjoying the show. It's Wednesday, so everybody's a little more tired, feet hurt, right? Ready to change to your tennis shoes. Look, welcome to today's session. It's titled Designing the Warehouse of the Future. It's one of those things we're passionate about because we work with clients, over the last 21 years of enVista, and we see a lot of things change in businesses, and we want to help companies be future focused. And we're going to talk about that today. I'm with enVista. I'm Nate Rosier, executive with enVista. With me is Dan Avila and Trevor Howard. They're responsible for selling and facility design for our clients. enVista's got 500 consultants around the world. We've probably worked around 3,000 warehouses globally. We've seen, over our 21 years, we've seen a lot of different things, a lot of different industries, and the changes over that time. We, in enVista, we implement Microsoft as well as pretty much anything inside of a warehouse. We have an automation team, puts in robotics and all that exciting things you see over there in the middle of the building. As well as warehouse management, transportation, labor management, and put all those things together. And so we kind of see how it works. And what's interesting to us is obviously COVID taught us that you can't predict the future, right? You really know what's going to happen. And even before COVID, we would see that, right? We would work at clients and they'd have automation designed for one order profile, right? And then their order profiles would change over time because the business changed, or they would introduce e-commerce or whatever. And the warehouses weren't adaptable, and it was very expensive to adjust. And so you think about designing your warehouse, one of the biggest questions is, what's going to happen over the next 15 years? I mean, warehouses are not 5-year investments. I mean, they're not. It doesn't matter what your depreciation schedule is. It's a 15 to 20-year investment. So what's going to happen over the next 15 to 20 years? Nobody really knows. So how do you design in that environment? So that's what we want to talk about today. I think one of the things when you're looking at designing warehouses is addressing some of the pain points you have today. So there are obviously pain points that we have today that are not going away. Labor costs. Those problems are not going away, right? As far as I can tell, most of the world is having the same problem. We're going to talk about how to design the warehouse of the future, how you take a look at that. We're going to talk about some of the mechanics of those designs and how to build the flexibility and resilience to adapt and adjust your warehouse over time. I think one of the things we're trying to do is help set the groundwork to think about how much flexibility do I need to have. So at enVista, we design supply chains end to end, and we also design warehouses. You want to use a lot of the same thought process when you design a supply chain. You need to have a mix of fixed and variable capacity, right? What percentage mix should I have of fixed and variable capacity? Fixed and variable costs, and how do I adapt that over time? And then we're going to include with how do you want to manage the warehouse of the future. I'll tell you, in the warehouses I go into, describe challenges they have in the warehouse with automation or labor turnover, or whatever it is. Biggest challenge I run into is how they're managed, right? It's how they're managed. And I know it's not people sitting in here. It's really, there's not a lot of focus on warehouse management in a company, right? Retail companies are focused on stores. Manufacturing companies are focused on the plants. Who cares about the warehouse? Who cares about the people working in the warehouse? Well, really just us and nobody else. To be honest with you, it feels that way, right? So how do we sort of manage in the new environment where it's going to be harder to get labor, but if you have talent in the warehouse, they're priceless, right? So we'll talk about that as well. So to get into it, I want to talk about things that we see universally. Now, what's interesting about this list is that it's not just a problem in the Midwest or in California or in Texas. This is all across the US, all across Canada. In fact, I think in Canada it's worse than in the US for the most part. We see this problem in Australia, Japan, certain parts of China, a lot of EMEA. Like, it's a relatively universal problem. Obviously, labor availability. I mean, I have a number of projects we're doing. We're trying to find warehouses where you can hire people to work in a warehouse. Who cares about transportation? If you can't get people to work in a warehouse, it doesn't matter how cheap the transportation is. Huge problem, right? So another thing is you think about space, the supply chain is really that buffer between supply and demand. And when supply and demand become very volatile, what happens? You run out of space. It's just the nature of the beast. So how do I build that, fixed and variable capacity is always very important. E-commerce, it's a blessing and a curse, right? It's great sometimes to have that e-commerce, but it's also the most volatile demand you have, and it's very labor intensive in the warehouse. So it could be 5-10% of the volume in the warehouse, but it could take up 30% of your labor, and it could create a lot of constraints. Bullwhip effect, I'm sure over the last couple of years, every company in here, I'm sure you all had perfect forecasts and demand plans, and your inventory never blew up at any point in time. But everybody else out here did. Huge issues, right? And those problems are probably not going away. They'll get better over time, but constraints will never end, and the variability is getting worse. It's not really getting better. I'll describe that. Demand uncertainty, I think we've all experienced plenty of that. Inbound visibility. This is one of my favorite things. Does the warehouse need to know what's coming at them on the inbound side? They kind of do. How many warehouses have that visibility? Very few, right? It's kind of an interesting challenge that we run into at a Universal side, but you'd be surprised how much more. Literally I have a client where there's a warehouse connected to the factory, and that warehouse doesn't know what's coming. I see it all the time. It's almost like, they don't need to know. They actually do need to know. So that's an important thing. And then systems, right? There's a lot of system changes over time that it's a complicated, let's see if this thing flips for me, to manage that. So look, part of this labor availability, this is a bill that we were always going to pay. The demographics of a lot of countries, right? With aging demographics around the world. And so at some point, you got to think, how many, look, I got a 22-year-old, and he makes obscene money as an auto mechanic, right? Crazy money. And all those jobs have tremendous inflation because there's just not enough people. It's not, right? And that's one problem. There's a lot of internal in the U.S. and other countries, migration of people moving from certain places into other places, and that's kind of another challenge. But in general, it's hard to pay enough because you raise your pay, the people you're competing against for labor, they're going to raise their pay, and it's kind of a spiral, right? So it's a hard thing to chase. We definitely see somewhere between 20 to 30% increases from 2019 until currently of base pay rates. There are a lot of ways to kind of think about that. I would tell you that in my experience, when you think about warehouse labor, you want to have good retention. That core team, it doesn't matter, you need to have really good pay. But the other thing that's important is, have that good team culture is really good. When you think about pay rate, it's always a bad calculation. I'll tell you, I ran a warehouse years ago, and we were considered in the top 10% most productive in that industry. And I reduced cost per case about 15% after that. And then the next year, I knocked another 12%. You'd be like, how did I do that? Well, actually, I raised the pay of everybody in that building. What you pay them is not the key factor of your cost. It's one thing you have to kind of think about. And labor management tools that are out there, the software, is a beautiful tool because you can pay people a lot of money and it doesn't cost you anything. What you pay them isn't really the driver. What the driver is the productivity. If I can draw my turnover down and I can get my productivity, that's how I make a more productive warehouse. But this problem is not going away. I don't see it globally anywhere where the pay is going to bounce back to 2019 levels. We kind of know where the space constraints are. Obviously at enVista, we have a lot of clients looking for space, and from either growth or for inventory purposes. You got to really think about space in terms of fixed versus variable. So how much do you really need? And it's an interesting challenge to try to manage my demand versus my space. You can't forecast perfectly. It doesn't work that way. So you have to have some flexibility to think about it. Now, nobody wants to have a half-empty warehouse, right? So how am I going to grow it over time and how I'm going to manage it? There's a couple ways to kind of think about capacity. One thing that's very important is there's about a 2-year lead time between the time that I know I need space and I actually get space if I have a new building and I'm putting in a system. You got to just think about it in terms. By the time I get through the contracts, I secure the equipment, some of the material handling equipment takes a long time, system implementation, hire, train, all that stuff. You got to be thinking, 18 months, you can do 18 months, but you got to be thinking about it too. Well, let's think about it like this. How fast does your company make decisions on big capital purchases? Yeah, it's not going to happen in a week. That's a 6-month process right there. So you got to be thinking 2 years out. How much capacity do I need? And if I need it 2 years from now, I got to start now finding space and securing that. So it's an ongoing issue. And we're obviously looking in every city that has warehouses, we're probably looking for space now in our company, helping companies find locations in their supply chain networks. And there are constraints everywhere. So you got to be thinking pretty far ahead with it. Again, e-commerce, blessing and a curse. One thing about e-commerce is that, we taught consumers that you could have it tomorrow, cheap. Right? Well, it's not cheap, it's expensive, but we're just not charging them. So, how do I build that surge capacity? I've run some omni-channel businesses in the past. I can tell you that e-commerce, if you try to take a look, a lot of consumer businesses have demand spikes during holidays. E-commerce spikes higher. We call it spikier, right? And trying to staff for those spikes is really hard. It's not just the seasonal pieces, it's the different spikes you have to deal with. So that creates, if you do e-commerce in a warehouse that does other channels, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's very difficult. I got a couple clients, they say we're out of space. I say, okay, what's your inventory turns? They say that's 2.5. It's like, you sure you want to build a warehouse for that? Right? It's very difficult for companies to forecast the demand and plan and buy and get the right amount of inventory in the right place. And you got to be really careful about how much space you want to build to support maybe an inventory strategy that's probably not the best. Or they're playing catch up from COVID or whatever it is. You kind of have to think about how I want to build up and go through the ebbs and flows of bullwhip. The bullwhip's going to happen, but one of the things that's always important, and there's a role that a warehouse has in the bullwhip effect. We have clients, especially working closeouts or counter-cyclicals or other things like that. You're going to have to build some capacity to deal with that. And you have to think about, well, if there's a typhoon in Hong Kong, I got to deal with that, and then all those situations create some buffer of inventory somewhere. So it's another thing to sort of plan for that we've learned. I think everybody's fully aware of the uncertainty of demand over the last couple of years and inbound visibility. I had one client, they had an interesting process where they had somebody from transportation working in a warehouse, and they just had made a board, like a chalkboard, and they would put all the trucks coming in, how many pallets are on it, how many SKUs, stuff like that. There are a lot of simple tools you can use to create visibility for the inbound side. I think that's a significantly overlooked capability that warehouses need, is to see what's coming at them. But from what I can tell, and partly because of the transportation challenges the last couple of years, it's gotten worse. Things have really gotten worse for warehouses. They don't know what's coming at them, so they don't know how to plan, they don't know how to have the right labor. So if they shift labor around, then they're taking people from the outbound side. So it's another thing that you'd be surprised of the benefits of doing that. As a systems integrator, we could tell you that I've seen some legacy systems. Yes, there are people, large companies still using AS400 WMS systems. We know several of them. But trying to connect all the dots. So when you think about the warehouse of the future, you got to make sure you got a good, stable platform. You see all that cool stuff out there, that automation. Someday, a lot of that stuff's going to be in your warehouse. What kind of system is going to support all that, right? You got to have a good system that's going to be the platform for that. We did a great project up in Canada with a great apparel retail company, and they identified huge cycle time issues inside their warehouses in Europe and the U.S. And they had one idea. They were like, well, the trucks take too long to get from Italy and all this stuff. It had nothing to do with it. It's the master data. Their master data was a mess. And so everybody had to go back and verify, what is this stuff? And this is a very successful billion-dollar company, and it's one of the biggest problems. We see that all the time. So, doesn't mean you have to rip and replace all the systems, but you have to make sure you have a stable platform so you can adapt in the future. Okay? And with that, I'm going to hand it to Dan.
Thanks, Nate. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Avila, Vice President of Sales for enVista. I've had the pleasure of being in industry and consulting for about 25 years, and I've designed about 200 fulfillment centers in my career, and Trevor and team are designing approximately 50 fulfillment centers a year for our clients. So we have a process that's pretty baked in, but one of the things I want to talk to you about today is about how you design the warehouse of the future. And a couple topics I want to cover, really about understanding the future, planning, getting yourself there, understanding all the things that can happen in your business over the next several years, and then designing that distribution or fulfillment center to evolve and change, okay? Nate mentioned that this is not a 5-year distribution center, it's 10, 15, 20 years, and it needs to pass the test of time, okay? Talk a little bit about labor. Certainly it's a challenge, but I'll talk about some tools and how to be effective in getting in the right place so you could limit your exposure to labor. And then, of course, having a transparent operation, because at the end of the day, your frontline supervisors are going to be your key folks. They're the ones that are going to have to run this fulfillment center, and we need to give them the tools and the visibility to be effective. Okay. So first of all, you don't know the future. So when we're designing these fulfillment centers, we're gathering a lot of data, we're gathering a lot of information. But all that does is tell you is where you were, okay? You really need to understand where you're going. So the first thing we do, we capture data, we understand baseline, what your business looks like today. Then we bring the executives in. And the executive team needs to include the C-suite, but it also needs to include product, manufacturing, sales, marketing. We need to understand where the business is going, okay? And I understand that is a challenge. It's a huge challenge. But we get everyone together. Typically, we'll do an off-site, and we'll start asking the executives teams some questions about the customer. We start with the customer. What are consumer behaviors? How are your customers going to change? Because what that does is that changes your orders, your order profiles, your volumes, your service level agreements, your turnaround time. So it really impacts how the distribution center is going to operate in the future. And we do as good a job as we can of understanding new products, new channels, channel shifts, all of that, because that has to be incorporated. And then we end up on some sort of agreement and an understanding of where the business can potentially go. And then that will feed into our design, but we'll also do some sensitivities if things change drastically. A great sensitivity that we used to do 15 years ago is what happens if e-commerce grows to 10%, 15%, 20% of retail. And that helped us design some DCs in the past that are still operating today and operating very effectively. So you're not going to have all the answers, but you have to ask the right questions and have an idea of where your business is going. Okay. Trevor's going to talk about this a little bit more, but when you design the warehouse distribution center, it needs to be flexible and it needs to evolve. So if you're not looking at least 10 years out, volume, growth, and then working backwards, you're making a mistake. And I say at least 10 years, it could be longer than that. But we're talking about flexibility, and I won't go too deep into that because Trevor will cover that on several of his slides. But flexibility is absolutely key to designing the warehouse of the future. Limiting your exposure to labor markets. So when I first got into consulting in the late 90s, we used to do a lot of network strategies. And one of the sayings that we had is you could never get fired. We tell this to our executives. You'll never get fired for putting a distribution center in Memphis, Tennessee, okay? Today, you could indeed get fired for putting a DC in Memphis, Tennessee, okay? Labor markets have changed, they have shifted. There are a lot of great firms out there that can do a labor study for you and tell you exactly where labor is available, what the living wage is, what you need to pay them, what the competition is charging and paying their employees. But Nate mentioned labor is expensive. So not only do you need to pay on market, okay, you can't be below market. You could be on market, but you also have to make it a fun and interesting place to work, okay? So there's a lot of things you could do. You need to have a great culture, but pay alone is not going to give you a stable workforce, okay? Many times you don't know this, but you're hiring an employee and they're just a temp. All they're doing is looking for a better wage. So if you don't have a great place to work, you're gonna lose those employees. We work with a couple real estate firms. One in particular is CBRE, and they have a great labor modeling tool. So they can tell you where the labor is, what a living wage is in that space, basically what you need to pay, and then how much labor is your potential, how far they have to drive. There's a lot of interesting information, borderline creepy in terms of how that data is acquired, but a lot of folks are doing it. There's a lot of great information. So don't do this alone. Don't put yourself in a bad market because you'll pay for it every day. And then finally, my last topic here is just transparency to line level supervisors. Really need to design an operation that can be run. There's a lot of really neat systems, visual management. A lot of the warehouse management system companies are doing what's called gamification. So your WMS, your scanners, your handhelds start to look like video games, and that whole concept of who is winning, that type of thing, it really works well with today's workforce. So that is another thing that a lot of folks are doing a really nice job of. Okay, and with that, I'll turn it over to Trevor to talk about designing the future.
Okay, good. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Thanks, Dan. Again, Trevor Howard, Senior Director within our Strategic DC Design Practice, and we've got a team of individuals that kind of take on these types of projects day in and day out. It's kind of core to what we do. I'm going to mostly build upon what Dan and Nate have started to kind of talk through here and talk through some of the challenges and visions and how that translates into the proper actions and principles going through a design practice. What you see on the screen right now are a bunch of key principles that are really critical to developing a design that will be resilient for the future and either the plan changes or some of the unplanned changes that come at you there. If we look at this list, a lot of these are fairly common sense, planning for the future or conducting sensitivity analysis. But what's really critical here is to bring all of these together into a cohesive plan. Make sure you're covering these in the right level of depth and bring them into an overall plan so that you're covering off on these. Missing any one of these can have real-world impacts to your operations. But designing for the future, really, it's really about creating criteria for the design criteria looking forward. A lot of times when these projects start, you start with collecting a base data set, as Nate and Dan said, and that's always backwards looking. What you want to be able to do is form a really good foundation for that baseline analysis. Understand how the operations are today, understand the challenge opportunities with that, but then begin to translate that into the forward-looking design criteria. What we tend to see, as mentioned, is best practices, usually about a 5 to 10 year outlook on that design criteria. That 5-year plan is often around for sizing and making smart decisions around material handling equipment. That 10-year plan is really for overall footprint and sizing of that facility. But that design criteria can include growth, and I can't stress enough that growth has to be at that appropriate level of detail to ensure that you are recognizing how the future might look different in the past. A lot of times what we see is product categories have different handling characteristics and different growth rates. That might make the future look wildly different than it does today. So having that growth down to the right level of detail is important. We also mentioned e-commerce type of impacts. The more you start to see sales channel shift, order profile shift, it creates new requirements on your operation there. But even beyond growth, when it comes to that business strategy, it's a lot of the things that we mentioned. It could be any changes to your inventory management strategies. Do you expect your turns to change? Will that drive any differences in cubic storage requirements in your facility? Do you expect changes on your supplier or customer base that may dictate requirements? Or even looking at potential mergers and acquisitions and the impacts that may have in operation. This upfront formal discussions and documentation of your business strategy is really vital to make sure that you set that future view correctly. The one thing you'll notice that the future look different than the past, and if there's one thing that certain plans you've done will the reality will play out much differently than what those plans are, even all the work being done there. The key here is to really incorporate flexibility into that design, and so that it can evolve and change. A lot of times in the past, what we saw is as we were pursuing higher levels of efficiency and automation, that a lot of times that flexibility would be more rigid in a design and sometimes restrict how that facility could expand. As you begin to explore some of the automation out there today, though, a lot of that automation now is having a lot more ability to expand quickly, have a lot more ability to adapt to those changes. But the key here is to make sure that as you evaluate this automation and higher levels of spend, that you're not just taking the quantitative side of things, but you're actually taking in some of the qualitative aspects of flexibility, expandability, and those types of things. I think Dan touched on sensitivity analysis. This is really critical and sometimes overlooked from our perspective. You want these design models, these analytic models structured in a way to be able to work through various scenarios. I think Dan touched on the kind of the growth as a primary one, but what we tend to see as a best practice is to have a lot of these design models set up in a way that you can plug in a low end or a high end of that range, look at the impacts of those on either sizing or even on recommendations of automation, and make sure you bound your decisions. If you do that sensitivity and those recommendations remain solid, you have a higher level of confidence in those solution in that go-forward plan. If you find that you see those recommendations changing as you do some of that sensitivity analysis, it warrants just a deeper dive into some of those key decisions and how those play out. But I can't stress enough how the sensitivity and the analytic modeling to do scenarios will really help evaluate some of the as we move forward. Combination of technologies is really vital as well. You'll see that in most best practice designs where it's not just one single solution that kind of carries forward, but rather it's a different types of technology that come forward to help drive that optimal design. As we look at our design criteria and how that affects some of that combination, one of the more basic things I'm sure most of you are aware of is the Pareto principle. We'll break down our SKU portfolio, do the 80-20 on that. Usually about 20% of your SKUs are driving 80% of volume. If you can focus your investments and some of those key efforts on putting some good sound technology around that 20% of your SKUs, you will find that has a much better payoff than trying to apply an automation principle more broadly across that SKU set. The one level deeper that I'd still recommend too is almost always if you drill down into the 3% of your SKUs, you almost guarantee that you'll see that drives 50% of your activity. So the more you can kind of slice and dice some of that data set and see how that drives towards different decisions on automation and drives better payback on performance, can really help hone in on the right combination of technologies on the processing side. On the inventory side of things, a lot of times what you want to do is you want to break that down into depth of inventory on a SKU level. So we will typically do a histogram. We'll show you how many SKUs have high pallet counts, how many SKUs have low pallet counts. And those high pallet count SKUs, there's a lot more broad range of solutions that can drive storage density operation that you can explore and evaluate the trade-offs. When you get to that lower end of the SKU range, inventory range, you find that you want more flexibility. Therefore, that single deep selective rack becomes more. But that's on the inventory storage side of things, is where you want to look at depth of inventory in those SKUs, how that drives a combination of technologies to try and drive that optimal design going forward. But again, most often we find the best practice is to bring a few of these technologies together so that it drives the best operational plan as well as financial payback on the overall plan. When it comes to justifying automation too, what we tend to find is that with shorter, more tactical type investments, most companies have hurdle metrics that are usually in that 2 to 3 year payback time frame. Pretty common to see that. When you start getting into more strategic investments like a DC design and all the automation and equipment that goes in there, we tend to find that clients like to expand that payback time frame with that strategic investment more into that 4 or 5 year time frame. I think what that really is reflecting is that it's not just purely a hard quantitative or financial play, but there's other strategic advantages that design happens to give you. Those types of things are often around capacity, expansion, and flexibility to meet the variability coming at them. It could be around improved service levels, improved quality. But again, what we tend to find is that as you get to these more strategic investments, the willingness to expand that hurdle rate on payback on this tends to drive more strategic investments within your operations. And this is just kind of summarizing what we said is building multiple paths is really kind of the whole end game here, so that if you know that the future's uncertain and you've got some defined strategies, having made those decisions and conducted that sensitivity and looked at multiple options, having the ability to adapt those paths going forward will ensure that you can react as that future plays out, maybe differently than what you had originally planned. This here is just an example of a project approach that we tend to use. What it's doing is we're essentially wrapping all of those principles into an overall project approach. You can see that there's 3 key steps to that: a discovery phase where you're doing some of that initial exploration with the client on data collection and normalizing that, making sure that the data is solid and has is clean and ready for use. Site observations to talk with people, understand challenges and opportunities, and there's the business strategy to make sure that you have that forward look. The center step is really where a lot of the heavy lift takes place, and that's where you're doing some forward-looking design criteria. Again, 5 to 10 years is quite common to do that. Concept analysis is really the key area, and it's critical that you do concept analysis by function area so that everything stands alone on its own. It is not subsidized by some other area, but that's where you can evaluate a wide range of different equipment concepts, make those individual decisions, and now you have all the pieces of the puzzle to bring that together into the overall layout. You got the strategic layout, and when you're making these changes, obviously you have technology gaps that have to be recognized as well. And then the final step is really wrapping a lot of the supporting details around all of these solutions, including equipment and list and costs, labor and financial summaries, management plans, knowing how to operate that facility, as well as a transition roadmap and an overall presentation. So I'm going to be brief here. This is just kind of, once again, reinforcing some of the things around the facility and resilience of doing design. You can see some of the kind of key tenets up here around future-proofing your operation and supporting a lot of these changes. But these are things that if you do all those actions and follow that kind of a general approach, you'll find that builds that resilience into your operation. The one thing we know about the planning process is that the future will play out differently. So what's really critical here is that while you do all the upfront planning and you work on that strategy and do that design criteria, you recognize that things will actually change, be different in the future than planned. So while predictions are good, building that resilience into your operation to be able to adapt as those things change on you are really vital for the facility and its operation. There's a number of areas that will change on you as you move forward and that you need to be thinking through and planning, but be prepared for that change. We touched on some of these. The customer requirements and or the customer base may change on you, driving different requirements on you, whether that's service level commitments or other. So that's an area where you want to kind of keep that top of mind and be able to understand how that customer base may change. Same thing on the inbound side, on the supplier side, changing supplier capabilities or changing supplier bases may provide more or less visibility and planning functions on the inbound side, as well as different requirements on the docks. Product category, again, want to reemphasize that breaking that down into the product categories and understanding the handling characteristics and how those growth may impact the future is really, really vital to making sure that you have that those covered. And then sales channels is really vital. We've touched again on the shift to e-commerce and the wildly different profile that drives and processing requirements on a facility. So sales channel shifts are really critical to not only understand and plan for, but be prepared to react to. I'm going to be brief here. Really, outside of the planning process, there are disruptions that happen. COVID was a perfect example of that, where even with the best laid plans, COVID hits and things get disrupted. So the point here is, as you're doing this, not only to look at your strategy and develop the plans that are known, but be prepared to react to that. That could be changes to capacity, that could be labor planning and how you would on-ramp that. It could be system and process changes to handle some of those disruptions. So the planning process is not just about the known and the strategy at all, but it's also around those disruptions that may come up and begin to have an impact on your operations. Now I'm just going to close here with just a summary that must be flexible in the design. That's the whole purpose of this. If you follow all those key principles and follow a project plan similar to that, I think you'll have the right dialogue and be able to make sure that your plans not only are covering the strategy, but also covering a lot of the uncertainty in the future there. I believe with that, I'll turn it back to Nate.
All right, thanks, Trevor. So one of the things that Trevor's team has innovated on is creating digital twins. If you're familiar with the concept, it's basically not exactly a simulation. Sometimes we do simulations for more detailed things, and if it doesn't need that much details to build that digital twin. What that enables you to do is create what-if scenarios. What if we grow faster than planned? What if we don't grow? What if labor costs double? What if we go from 5% e-commerce to 20% e-commerce? Those are the things that are ways you build in a resilience and the ability to kind of look out 15 years and say, okay, we're ready. If this happens, we're going this direction. If this happens, we're going in that direction. And so that way, you want to be careful not to design yourself into a corner, basically, right? Where am I going to put my automation? If I'm going to put in an auto store or an OpEx or whatever it is, how do I make sure I have room to either expand it or contract it based on where things are going? And can I connect it to the rest of the automation effectively? I mean, I love the things that unload the containers, right? Isn't that great? To get a floor-loaded container. Yeah. Did you make space for that? Because the ROI is not great today, but it will be in 5 years. You know what I mean? You have to kind of think, look, eventually I'm going to connect all these dots. So how do I design so I can connect the dots? And if my demand patterns change, how do I shift that? Okay? So that's basically how we do these designs, is create all those scenarios and sensitivities to build that. Just want to mention something about warehouse management, managing a warehouse. Look, I was in the Army. The Army is designed so that the sergeants, the first line supervisors, run the Army. The generals are great on TV, some of them. The colonels usually just irritate you. The captains give decent orders. The sergeants run it. That's the way it works. The warehouse really should be very similar. And here's why. Essentially, all these changes that need to happen, right? Disruptions, labor, all that stuff. That's what the managers need to do. I see too often that the warehouse management or even the supervisors are focused on trying to get the systems to work. They're in the weeds doing very detailed things. They need to be managing, right? And I will tell you, I can give you some ideas of how to think about when are you winning. You're winning if those first line supervisors are doing their own continuous improvement. They see the information, they can see the process, they're there, and they know who do I want to hire, who do I want to fire, what process changes I want to make, how do I build continuous improvement. When you design a warehouse, usually you create a stepwise improvement in productivity, but you have to design a warehouse so that the first line supervisors can do their own continuous improvement on top of that. Don't make it so complex they can't even get involved in that. Don't get them in the weeds to try to figure out how the systems work. When I say build a platform of the systems, that basically means something that you don't have to constantly maintain, that's hard to manage, and something that provides good input so the supervisors can use those metrics to manage. It's very critical. The best run warehouses we see, those first line supervisors run the warehouse, and they have all their metrics in front of them in each of their areas, and they know how they performed each day and how to get better. If you're not doing that, it's going to be really hard to manage in any disruption because everybody's in the weeds trying to run around and figure out just how to get orders out the door. Firefighting is the opposite of management. Okay? It's the opposite of management. And I can tell you that's pretty common, right? So we think about being proactive. You need to be proactive about designing your supply chain. You need to be proactive about designing the warehouse and making sure that you know how to adapt. When we say flexible capacity, a lot of times that's a 3PL partner that's nearby, right? They can handle the ebbs and flows. The other thing is, what should you really do in this warehouse? How many value-added services? A warehouse is just a warehouse to the marketing team or the sales team is just like an empty closet. They'll just throw crap in there, right? That's the way it works. I got space, fill it up. That's pretty much what you think about. So how do we make sure that we keep our warehouses focused so they can be proactive what to do next? Visibility is very important. I know we design systems where you have to think about how do I want to manage a warehouse? How do I get productivity in a warehouse? You say, well, I'll put in this picking system and I'll go from 20 people picking to 15 people picking and that's my benefit. That's nice, it'll help. You know how you really create productivity in your warehouse? Send everybody home early. Get done early. Send the whole warehouse home, right? How do you do that? I'll just tell you a quick story. Years ago when I run this warehouse, this was probably 55, 60% mothers working in this warehouse. They're fantastic. If we could finish our shift by 3:30, they were the happiest mothers ever because they could get their kids out of school. So I designed the shifts so that, it should end at 5, but if you get productive, you're done at 3:30. And then I created a system so everybody could see, based on our productivity by zone, right? How long will it take to finish? So everybody would know what's going on, right? You need a system that'll tell you, based on today's work, here's what the effort in all the zones, and here's how to eliminate the bottlenecks, and then speed the whole thing up. And that's how I got those productivity numbers. That's how our clients really do it, is think about how does everybody in the warehouse work together. We just kind of talked about the key KPIs. The digital twin, like the warehouse is going to evolve over time. What Trevor's team does is amazing, is that, they build that digital twin, and over time they can adjust it. They can show, hey, look, you need to go from here to here, and they kind of have that. You need to have your own sort of version of digital twin just to understand, hey, look, in this situation, here's what we're going to do. So you're not trying to reinvent the wheel every time that some change happens to your business, okay? The flexibility, again, don't design yourself into a corner. Make sure you have some capacity to expand and contract and adjust. Make sure your systems can connect to all those cool toys that are out there. Eventually, your warehouse is going to have all of them, right? And you don't want to have to put in a new system every time because you'll never put them in. Because everybody knows how hard it is to put in a new system, right? It takes forever, or feels like it. The material handling automation, there are a lot of cool things out there. You got to think about how I build my foundation. Focus on the core. So think about your warehouse as a strategic asset to the company and what is core to that business, and make sure that the customer is always winning, and invest in that top automation that makes the customer happy and high service levels. That way you'll be a strategic asset. You got to think about, when I design this warehouse, what is it going to look like, and then what's the experience the associate's going to have. The best warehouses we see, they're branded. On the retail side, stores are obviously very branded with it. They wear the uniforms, the whole thing. Their warehouses, the best retail warehouses, looks like a store, right? They got beautiful bathrooms. They got great break areas. They've got a lot of metrics and measures and, family pictures and things like you got to think about the warehouse that way as well. As the automation expands, you can see that the role of management and supervision will change as well. Again, we see too much that the supervisor and managers are too deep trying to make the systems work. You got to design your system so that they do the grunt work and the managers and supervisors manage. So that's an important piece. And then, hey, look, it's very complicated. All this stuff's complicated. We have clients for a reason. We help them through this. If you have any other questions, we're right over here at the booth, the enVista booth right here. And Trevor, Dan, and I will be over there along with the rest of us. And we're happy to tell you more about it. If you have any questions, let us know. Are there any? We got like a minute left. Anybody have any questions real quick before we?
I'll also add, if you want these slides, come over to the booth and we'll send you a link to those slides if anyone wants them.
Any other questions? Well, thanks. Appreciate you attending. I hope you have a great show, and we'll see you at the booth.
Thank you.